All right. I just finished creating our sample or small graphene project. I'm using Django and Graphene, and as you can see, I wrote my first query here, and it retrieves the data. I was pretty much following the tutorial on Graphene. I basically set up the Django project. This is a normal, Django project, the same way you'd set up a Django project. And of course, there is creating of a virtual environment, then installing Graphene, which I did follow through, and then starting our project cookbook, which you can see that I created, and then creating the app ingredients, which I created. Doing the first migrations, I did that. Defining the models, which I did. Have two models here, category and ingredient. Up to this point, it is pretty much normal Django. And then adding the app to installed apps, which I did, which is pretty, again, normal Django stuff. Then loading test data into our models in the database. So which I did, I have using fixtures. This is a pretty standard way of loading data. You can either use fixtures or migrations, but in this case, we are using fixtures. So I pretty much downloaded these fixtures and loaded them. So I have my fixtures ingredients. So this is how we load fixtures. So for example, here we have a model PK and then the fields. So if you look at the model, that is what we have. And then so we loaded 2 records in the category model, and then we loaded 4 records in the ingredient model. And as you can see, the field's name, notes, and category is basically what we have here: name, notes, and category. So that's it about the fixtures. And then, of course, we went ahead to register it to the admin site. Pretty normal Django stuff. So that we would have admin. So that's it. Cool up to that point. Still normal Django stuff. All right. So at this point now, we entering into GraphQL. So basically, if you know what is GraphQL, so I'm just pulling out the doc so that we see what that is. So it's basically a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling queries with your existing data. So that's what GraphQL is. So the first thing we did is actually taking some notes here. So we created a schema, right? Let me pull out my schema that I created. Where is it? It is basically here, all right? So as you can see, we are going to create the schema. We created the schema in the main project. This is not within the app, it is in the main project. That's where we created it. So the schema basically has types, and these types kind of correspond to the Django models. So if we take a note that I wrote here, we see that Graphene needs to know about each type of object which will appear in the graph. Okay, so first of all, GraphQL presents, um, objects as a graph structure, rather than, a hierarchical structure that we would normally see in the REST APIs. So, and we are told that, of course, in Django here we are using Graphene, and Graphene needs to know about each type of object which will appear in the graph. Okay, and the graph has a root type through which all access begins, and that is the query class. Okay, so to create types, uh, you know, uh, to create GraphQL types for each of the Django models, we subclass the Django object type class. So, so what we are going to do is that we need to create a GraphQL type for each of the models, all right? And then it is this type that actually represents an object which is mapped to a model. So, and we said to create a type, we subclass the Django object type. So we have two models, category and ingredient. So the first type is category type. So which subclasses the Django object type. And in the meta, you can see that, the model is the category, and then the fields are ID, name, and ingredient. So then this is another type. So we have two types, and we also have two models. So that's it. So we have the query class. The query class, it is the root type, okay? Uh, you know, through which all access begins. So all access begins here in this query. All right. So this query subclasses the graphene object type. Okay. So as we can see, our so our first query will be on the ingredients, and we can see all ingredients because this is like a list of ingredient types. Okay, all right, and then so this will return this will basically have a list of objects of ingredient types, and then this category by name will have just a single field, which is defined like this. And then now we write methods to resolve this data. Okay, resolve all ingredients. So this is pretty much a normal Django query, which is actually optimized. Select related, if you want to select related Django. So this is according to the Django documentation. Select related. So returns a query set that will follow foreign key relationships, selecting additional related object data when it executes its query. So what this allows us to do basically is, as you can see in the ingredient model, okay, category is a foreign key, okay. So if we didn't do this, for example, if we did this, it means that would have returned our data with just foreign keys. But if we do this, now let me go back with just foreign keys. So it means that if I wanted to get data in category, another query will have to be executed, right? But when we do select related, category data at this point, when the query runs, category data will also be queried at that point. So which means there will be no additional queries for select related. That is pretty much Django. Our queries are we resolve also the category by name, and we write a query just like this normal Django query. And now this is now our, we pass the query to to the schema. All right. So now this will be our schema. And basically, if you try to search what is GraphQL schema, it basically says a GraphQL schema is a description of the data that clients can request from a GraphQL API. So this basically is the definition of our data that we can query. All right. So let's follow through. I'll just go ahead and close this. Okay. All right. So we defined our schema. All right. Our now time to test everything. So there is a comment here that you can think of this as being like your top level urls.py. So if you go to urls.py, this is the top level, so which means that if I'm trying to access any endpoint, whatever URLs I have here will be available, you know, as endpoints. So if I, for example, go to 8000 and do this, we see that, you know, the top level URLs will have admin and GraphQL. So we just added this, but this is what we mean by the top level URLs. Okay, perfect. So we proceed. So if we are to test everything, one thing is we have to update the settings. So when we installed Graphene Django, we have to add it to the settings.py, which we already did. So one more thing is that we have to add the schema to Graphene config. Okay, now this is it. So it means that when we are defining our URLs, our our schema is already known. Okay, so we don't have to worry. So let's go ahead with creating the GraphQL and GraphQL views. So GraphQL is sort of the tool that is used to, an in-browser tool that is used to execute the queries. Uh, Basically, it's this. So let's proceed and see how that goes. Okay, so first of all, we created our, we added a URL. So we are saying that unlike a RESTful API, there is only a single URL from which GraphQL is accessed. So that's kind of different from REST APIs. If I'm to pull out one of my REST APIs, you find that um, I have a bunch of like URLs here for different endpoints, but we are saying that for GraphQL, we have one URL for all the endpoints. That's kind of interesting. We'll see how that works. All right. Then this view also serves as a GraphQL endpoint. Okay. And if we want to use GraphQL, which is basically this tool for querying, writing our queries, we pass GraphQL as true. So GraphQL is already like integrated. It's not like a separate thing we have to install. It's already like part of the, of the GraphQL system. So we just pretty much need to just, pass this parameter and we are good to go. And it's kind of integrated already. So once we access this endpoint, GraphQL, we'll have access to it. So if I'm to show you, if I do this, all right, now if I pass GraphQL, boom, right, That's pretty much interesting, yeah. So we also did this in urls.py, which is here. Perfect. All right. Um, and there is something interesting here is that if we didn't specify the target schema in the Django settings, we can also do this. We can also pass it to the URL as a parameter. So basically what we are saying is if we actually didn't pass graphene, if we didn't define graphene in the settings as a setting, uh, so basically if we see we define the schema here, okay, which is cookbook.schema.schema. Now, if you see on my URL here, I didn't have to pass it schema equals, I didn't have to do that because I already have it here in my settings. But assume that I didn't pass this in the settings, I didn't have this in the settings, I'll have to do this. So let's try that. So I'll just comment out this, and if I go and run my GraphQL, boom, it's a mess, right? So let me just go ahead and schema equals. So I basically need to import my schema. So I import so from basically cookbook, which is right. So as you can see, schema is defined in our schema is in the cookbook. Project is not inside the app. So we'll say from that schema we import. So at that point we are basically inside now the schema. We are going to import this schema. Okay. All right. So we are importing schema. So once we say schema equals to schema. So which is this basically. All right. So let's see how that goes. So do this again, and boom, it works just fine. Okay, perfect. So you know, to access, of course, GraphQL, are you this is basically it. So what the endpoint we are accessing here is basically this, and we now don't need to say maybe add different endpoints or whatever as we do in REST endpoints. You know, this is all. This is one URL where we can specify our queries. Yeah. So let me just assume I wanted more stuff. Okay, let me go back to my schema. All right, so ingredient has also notes. So let's say I wanted notes as well. So all ingredients. And what is interesting is when I write query, then I open bracket. When I say all, it's like it already knows what I defined in my query. All right, it already knows it. So it even knows the type, okay, that I'm expecting. So I find that kind of interesting. The intelligence is pretty much good. So I want to get this data. Now at this point, I'm actually having access to all the objects. Now I need to define the kind of data I need to return. So I have this object basically has ID name. So when I write ID, boom, it already knows it. Boom, the intelligence is really great. So I run, it returns this. Now let's say I also want notes. Interesting. Boom. Wow, this is nice. So let's see if I have any other. It's a category. Mm, wow, this is nice. So you can see category comes with the ID. Okay, this is interesting. So category has ID, name, and ingredients. Okay, so let's say I want also name. Boom. Wow. Wow. This is nice. This is nice. So let me see if I attempt writing another query, say category by name. Boom. R. That's name. Boom. That didn't work. Is required to be a string. All right. Let me just first leave this alone. All right. But pretty much what we see here is that we are returning the data, and I think this is like great. It is pretty nice. There are a few functions here. I see prettify. And by the way, looks like we don't have to always put the word query. We can just like define it as an object, just starting with this, open bracket, and then closing with a closing bracket. So that's pretty much it. This was a successful way to explore how GraphQL works, and pretty interesting. Let me see if there is anything I missed here. Um, so GraphQL presents your objects to the world as a graph structure rather than a, a more hierarchical structure. We talked about this. Graphene needs to know about each type of object which will appear in the graph. Okay, all right. Then the graph has a root type through which all access begins, which is the query class that we saw. To create the GraphQL types for each of the Django models, we subclass the Django object type class. This will basically automatically define GraphQL fields that correspond to the fields of the Django models. Interesting. The GraphQL types will be listed as fields in the query class. Okay, perfect. And how to test things? I think of the schema as being something like the top urls.py, GraphQL, which we saw as our tool in browser tool to help us write the queries and test the endpoints. Is that it's a web-based integrated development environment to assist in the writing of and executing of GraphQL queries, and it provides a simple and easy way of testing the project. Okay, we did update our settings, and then we did learn that unlike a RESTful API, there is only a single URL from which GraphQL is accessed, and requests to this URL are handled by Graphene's um, GraphQL view, which we saw here. Uh, this so the requests are handled by this view. And then the last point is the view serves as GraphQL endpoint. So this view serves as, the endpoint. Since we want to use GraphQL, we specify that on the parameters, which is this. So that's it that I've learned through, exploring or trying out this. And if I, think about, let's say, Django REST, um, well, in my mind, I'm thinking about, okay, let me go back to the schema. I'm thinking about a schema, sort of like, even in Django REST, we have like, let's say, after writing your models, then you have serializers, then you have your views. Um, so our basically we have those three levels: models, serializers, and views are in Django REST. So I kind of see that this corresponds to that. Basically, I would see the schema definition of schemas of the schema, and you know and the types and the query and all this. I would see it corresponding to the serializer somewhat as the next level after the models, okay, and mapping to the models and the model fields and stuff. I would look at this as my serializers of sorts, and then are my views, which I can do API views or view sets or whatever. Um, I would look at that uh, as the GraphQL view, which I didn't have to write by myself. Let me see what is in here. Oh, I really hadn't looked at this, but interesting that I don't have to write views. It's just like this, GraphQL view handles it all for me. And if I was in Django REST, I would be writing a bunch of API views and view sets and stuff, basically class-based views. But here, just one view, that is, part of Graphene Django is handling it for me. Yeah. So I find that interesting. And that's what this point is about. Unlike the RESTful API, there is only a single URL from which GraphQL is accessed. Requests to this URL are handled by Graphene's GraphQL view. Amazing, amazing. So this has been pretty interesting. I'll I'll make the next video if I go on exploring. Thank you. All right.